and I want to tell you about a guy named Bob Taylor. Bob was the director of Information Processing Techniques Office of the Advanced Research Projects Agency at the Defense Department. And as the director of the IPTO, Bob was responsible for overseeing a number of time-sharing research projects that the ARPA was funding. Early computers were entirely batch-oriented. When you wanted to run something on the computer, you submitted a job request. And an operator, usually a human operator, would queue that job up. It would execute, and eventually you'd get some output, printout, a tape, a deck of punched cards. At this point, there was a huge effort around developing time-sharing systems because that way of computing was very, very slow and very, very inefficient. Time-sharing systems allow multiple users to access the system at the same time. It simulates a reactive, responsive, real-time environment. As part of that oversight, Bob had to log in to these various time-sharing systems at these universities, remote universities. And in order to do that, he needed to have terminals in his office at the Pentagon. Individual physical dumb terminals, each one wired independently to the system that it connected to. Bob noticed two very important things about this arrangement. First, at each of these universities where there was a time-sharing system, there had developed a hub of computer scientists and engineers and mathematicians. If those systems could be networked together, those people, those computer scientists and engineers, could work together. They could share their research more easily. They could share their work and increase the pace of advancement. And secondly, he noticed that having to physically move between different terminals in his office every time he wanted to switch between computers was a giant pain in his neck. And they took up a tremendous amount of space. So if networking these systems together couldn't create a broader, stronger community of people working together on developing this very important technology, at the very least, he'd get those damn terminals out of his office. It's entirely up to you how you want to take this anecdote. You can take it to say that the great driver of innovation is community, or that the great driver of innovation is laziness. I honestly think it's somewhere in the middle. But Bob Taylor was kicking off an effort to create a network that would allow these systems to talk to one another. Nowadays, we kind of take it for granted, but back in the 1960s, computers were not considered communication devices. They essentially did math. Some researchers were experimenting with graphics and sound, hypertext, but for the most part, trying to connect computers together and make them talk to each other was not a huge priority for the computer science world. I mean, think about it. In late 1960s, things like packet switching were still largely theoretical. They were discussed in academia. Getting two computers of the exact same make and model, running essentially the same software to talk to one another, was a monumental task. How could you even think about getting two different computers, perhaps by two different manufacturers, to talk to each other? There were no hardware interfaces. There certainly were no software protocols. And when ARPA reached out to the tech giants of the time, like AT&T and IBM, and asked them to bid on a contract to try and solve this hardware problem, this hardware interface problem, they didn't even bother to bid. It wasn't worth their time. Some smaller companies did bid, and one of them, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which is now BBN Technologies, won the contract. And they started developing a device, a machine called the IMP, the Interface Message Processor. These machines were essentially giant packet switch, and by giant, like refrigerator-sized packet switching nodes. They are the grandfathers of all of the modern network internet routers that drive the internet today. The very first one of these machines was delivered to the University of California in Los Angeles in late August of 1969. And a little bit more than a month later, in early October, a second one was delivered to the Stanford Research Institute. This is the IMP in the background. The guy on the left is Charlie Klein. The guy on the right is Bill Duvall. Charlie was a student programmer working under the legendary Leonard Kleinrock at UCLA. Bill was working in the Augmented Research Center at SRI under Doug Engelbart. And I'm going to assume that most people here know who Doug Engelbart is, one of the heroes of our industry. Both of them had set out to get their host machines to talk to these new IMPs that were delivered by BBN. UCLA had an SDS Sigma 7 host, and SRI had a much more powerful, much more advanced SDS 940. If you're familiar with like computer history, especially with the work that Doug Engelbart was doing with hypertext, you may know this system Genie, the SDS 940, where he did all of his pioneering hypertext research. So going back to October 29th, 1969, it was late. It was around 10:30 p.m. And these two programmers were getting ready to conduct one of the most important experiments in human history. They had built this primitive network, two host computers, pretty simple network diagram. Computer connected to IMP, phone lines in between, another IMP, computer. And they had written some software. This software would allow Klein in UCLA to type on his terminal and have that data sent to the IMP and then transmitted over the phone lines to the IMP at SRI, where it would be fed into Genie. Genie would respond, and that response would go back over the connection to the IMP, over the phone lines to UCLA, and would print out on Klein's terminal. So in order to run any commands on Genie, the first you had to enter the login command, which was LOGIN. So I want you to imagine this scene. These two programmers sitting in computer rooms. If you've never been in a computer room, they're cold, they're dry, they're not particularly comfortable, very loud. They're sitting in their computer rooms. They have their old 1960s style telephones sitting next to them, and they're talking to one another. And Klein types an L. And that L gets sent to the IMP, and it gets transmitted over the phone wires to the IMP at SRI, and it gets sent to Genie, and Genie receives the L, and it sends back an L, and it goes to the IMP over the phone lines, into the other IMP, and into the Sigma 7 at UCLA. Because really, terminal echo is that old. A fraction of a second later, L appears on Klein's screen, and he asks Duval over the phone, "Did you get the L?" And he says, "I got the L." And he types an O. "Did you get the O?" "Got the O." And Klein types G. And he hears Bill Duval say over the phone, "Wait a second, the system crashed. I'll call you back." All great things in computer science start with failure. When you type in LOG, it turns out Genie, which was an incredibly advanced system for its time, was also very, very helpful. And it knew when you typed in LOG, the only possible command you could be typing in that context was login. So what did it do? It auto-completed it for you. And the software that they had built was not designed to accept multiple characters being shoved over the interface all at the same time, and it crashed the software. They were able to quickly patch that error and get the link working. I think it's a good indication that really for 47 years, autocomplete has been driving programmers crazy. But that night, Charlie Klein sat there at a terminal in UCLA, logged into a machine at Stanford. He executed commands, he ran programs, he was using these remote resources. He was using it over a common, repeatable interface. He was the first person to do that. He would not be the last. Millions more would follow. We all do that every day as part of our lives. By the end of that year, by the end of 1969, that network of 2 nodes had doubled to 4. But by the early 1980s, there were over 100 nodes connected to the ARPANET. They had developed TCP/IP and standardized on it, and now other government agencies were busy building new networks using those standards that came out of ARPANET, like the National Science Foundation with NSFNet, and NASA had a network. Towards the end of the 1980s, there was an effort to merge and combine these networks, and something that started to resemble what we would recognize as the modern internet came out of it. In the early 90s, there were legislative efforts to open up that internet to non-academic and military traffic. Actually, a lot of this was pushed forward by then-Senator Al Gore. So if we all remember the jokes about Al Gore said he invented the internet, this is really what it's all coming back to. Obviously, he didn't invent the internet. He was very instrumental in trying to push this legislation forward that would open the internet up to commercial interests and also to hobbyists. The internet wasn't just going to be for the military and for academics anymore. We were going to have our say too. The last 47 years have been as much defined by that evening and the evenings that followed it as they are by anything monumental, like the fall of the Berlin Wall. The reason that most of us are in this room this morning is the work that was being done by these gentlemen and their colleagues in 1969. We have been a part of this revolution that Charlie Klein and Leonard Kleinrock and Bill Duvall and Doug Engelbart and Bob Taylor and hundreds of others whose names I don't have time to mention or whose names have been honestly lost to history, that they started. And we're the ones who are continuing to drive it forward today. I mentioned we have our say, and I mean that very personally. In the late 1980s and 1990s, I was a very avid BBS user. I was heavily involved in the BBS community. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, with what BBSs were and what the community around them were, BBSs were essentially applications that you could run on a personal computer that would allow other people to connect to your machine, often just one person at a time. You only had one line. To connect to your computer, and they could share files and run games, essentially use the resources of your computer over a phone line. We use these things, like I said, to share files, to play games. You could send messages to other people on the system that use that BBS. Some BBSs were really advanced. They were connected to something called FidoNet, and you could use that to send messages to people who were connected to other BBSs. It was like email, except it took days to get there. And in the early 1990s, I would spend hours every day after school dialing into different BBSs and seeing what new files were available and what new games were available and what new programs were available and uploading things that I was working on, talking to people, and forming friendships. One of my very favorite ones was an Amiga file sharing BBS. And I think it's funny because I never owned an Amiga in my life, but they had really cool games. And they had really cool games that reset every 4 hours. So you were often very time limited on how much, like, obviously they had one phone line. So they wanted to let more people have a chance to play. So you were time limited. They reset every 4 hours. So like this was a serious business. But the owner of that BBS in 1993 decided that he wanted to turn it into a business. And he expanded by installing a SCO Unixware server. He got a leased shared subscriber line connection to the internet and started selling shell accounts for $10 per month. Shell accounts, if you've never used one, are really, really cool. You could dial in just like you were dialing into a BBS, but instead of seeing a text menu like this, it's a really bad implementation. Like the ANSI artwork of like 1980s and 1990s BBSs was a thing to behold. But instead of seeing a menu like this, you're just dropped into a shell prompt, just like right into a bash shell. You could access Usenet. I don't know if anybody's not familiar with Usenet, but it's the granddaddy of all internet forums and just as flamey. You could get real email, like the email that only took hours to get where it was going. You could use FTP. You could use IRC. You could use Gopher and Wise to search for documents and code on the internet. It was really, really amazing. This was how I first experienced the internet, from a bash prompt. Even then, we had this sense that we were just slightly ahead of a very important curve. We had access to something that was very young and very raw, but you could tell that it was going somewhere. There was going to be something important. I don't want to give you the idea that we were all prescient geniuses. Certainly not me. In my shell account, I had access to the web. I had the Lynx browser was installed on our server, and you could browse websites. The web in 1993 and early 1994 was very hard to search. There were index sites, so like literally you would email an index site maintainer and say, hey, put my site on your index, and they would put it in their index. But they were often very, very incomplete. Part of my early opinion of the web is probably because the web was always designed to be viewed in a graphical browser. And I remember distinctly the first time I ever saw the web in a graphical browser. I was at a tech meetup, and one of the attendees had lugged their desktop computer to this meetup because their ISP had just started offering something new and revolutionary, slip accounts. If you're not familiar with a slip account, slip was a very early way of trying to extend IP over dial-up connections. It came before PPP, so like if you remember dial-up internet at all, you remember like PPP connections. This was before PPP, and so much worse. The serial line internet protocol, I think. So his ISP had just started offering these slip accounts, and that lets you connect. And he had a Windows machine, and he could use the Windows socket library, the WinSock DLL, to establish a slip connection to his ISP, and actually turn his computer into a node on the internet. Holy S, right? So this big group of us, were all gathered at this tech meeting, and we're all kind of huddled around, this beige 1990s PC, as he dials up and connects to his internet at 2,400 bits per second. Just bits, no kilos, no megas. and launched the Mosaic browser. It's funny because it's been more than 20 years, and I can still remember watching, like it happened yesterday, this very low resolution photograph of a basket of purple orchids rendering in this browser, slowly, almost line by line. And I remember being struck by what I was witnessing and how incredibly pointless and silly it seemed. And I turned to my friend. The image still hadn't finished loading. It took forever. And I said, I mean, I guess it's kind of a cool toy, but who would ever use that for anything important? Turns out a lot of people used it for some important stuff. I mean, over the course of the 90s, almost entirely due to the explosive growth of the web, the internet grew at this stupefying pace. Companies were starting to see commercial opportunities in the internet. And these first signs of how disruptive to our society the internet was going to be just started to emerge. The internet had been, since its beginning, home to a number of different subcultures. Engineers, scientists, researchers, and hackers. And despite all of their differences, all of these subcultures share some very important core values around the idea of sharing knowledge, sharing code, making information as free as possible. So it was really easy for those of us in the BBS subculture to integrate ourselves into that, right? Even though our subculture had developed almost entirely independently from the internet world, we also valued sharing. It was a lot of times built into these BBSs. If you wanted to download files, you were expected to upload files. If you wrote a neat program that did something useful or something amusing, you were expected to share it so others could use it and learn from it. But that is not the culture of corporations, right? The first attempt at commercializing the internet was a giant, dismal failure. Urged on by well-meaning dreamers and schemers, they attempted to sort of force the model of the old economy onto the internet. They saw the internet as nothing more than an untapped source of wealth, like oil in the ground. All we have to do is drill in there and suck all the value out, right? The internet, though, was decentralized and anonymous by its very nature. And decentralized and anonymous does not fit well with the corporate model that relies on centralized and accountable to make money. In 1995, there were roughly 75 million people on the face of this earth that had access to the internet. By 2001, that number had increased to 500 million. But as the internet population increased, those profits never really materialized. The old economy couldn't mold the internet to fit it. It was actually quite the opposite. For the first time, the general population was being exposed to this idea of decentralized distribution. And granted, they didn't have necessarily the same core values around sharing and things like that. They did enjoy free MP3s, and they gutted the music industry as a result. And even then, you could see the sword hanging over the head of print journalism. Why pay for something when you can get it for free? From 2000 to 2002, the stock market lost $5 trillion in value. Most of the companies from that first tech boom failed. Very few survived. And I happen to work for one of them. My name is Samantha Quinones. I work at AOL. Before you ask me, no, I can't get you a CD. AOL, I'm sure you know, was the king of dial-up in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And at the very height of AOL's rise, we bought Time Warner. Time Warner. I remember when AOL bought Time Warner. It seemed like a sign of how things were changing. The new economy was going to swallow up the old and destroy it. Turns out it wasn't really a sign of anything, right? The old economy was actually pretty strong. It was going to persevere. In the aftermath of that crash, Time Warner essentially spit out what was left of AOL like a cherry seed. But like the other handful of companies that managed to survive the dot-com bubble, AOL managed to reinvent itself, and today we're a media company. We're a big media company. We've got a global reach of about 500 million users. But I'm not here to talk about why AOL is an interesting company or a cool company to work for. I think it is, and if you want to hear about that, please find me, and I'll be happy to talk your ear off. But there are some common traits of companies that survived the dot-com bubble and that are surviving now, thriving in the digital media world, that I think are important indicators of some of the things that are coming in the future. And I can use media as an example here for two reasons. Obviously, I work in media. It's an industry that I understand. But also, media has been reeling for a long time. For more than a decade, it's been wandering through this wasteland, trying to find its way back to profitability. And it's constantly changing. The companies that are thriving now in media understand the need to innovate. They understand that they need to contribute. They realize that it's not enough to yearn for the days of centralized distribution and tightly controlled channels. To make it, you have to understand the world that you're operating in. You need to understand the internet. And more importantly, you need to understand how it has changed us and the way that we view ourselves and the world around us. I mean, you can laugh at VR for investing in VR technology. Immersive content may be a tremendous success. It may be a huge flop. I don't know. Obviously, I have a pretty bad track record of predicting these things. But I see it as a good example of a company embracing experimentation. And it's not just us. There are other media companies. Vox you can barely see there. Netflix, I feel, is like almost as well known for its engineering and operations culture as it is for its content. They are innovating over the process of building software, constantly testing everything. I watched a tech talk recently by one of their engineers where they said that they had some 7 million different permutations of their of each of their pages that they were constantly testing in an automated way. They live and die by data. They're constantly testing and experimenting to find out what works. Vox, which is actually more in like the same business line as AOL, is willing to take risks on new content formats to study how they're received, to iterate tightly over that feedback so they can keep moving in the right direction. They put engineering forward. They understand the value of being part of the technology community. Today, there are 40% of the world's population has access to the internet. It's roughly 3.4 billion people. Think about that for a second. My grandparents were born near the turn of the 20th century. When my grandparents were born, there were about 1.6 billion human beings on the planet total. Now, just the number of people on this planet, which is not a majority, who have access to the internet is double that. We are having ongoing discussions in international law about whether or not internet access is a fundamental human right, because we understand that having internet access changes the way children develop. It changes the way people are educated. And do we want to keep moving forward as a global human society with 40% of the population having access to this advanced way of learning and 60% not having it? AOL used to have a mission of creating a utility that was as important to people as telephone or television. I think it's cute. I love this picture. The fact is the internet has far surpassed both of those things. I don't remember the last time I actually had a landline telephone in my house. My cell phone is a phone in name only. It is a portable internet device. I don't really use it to do much calling. I have a television, which I use to stream video over Netflix. The internet has become the medium for human communication in this century, for a huge and growing plurality of humankind. It is not just a utility, though. The stone axe extended the human hand and arm. It made us stronger. It made us more capable hunters and butchers. Domesticated plants and animals multiplied our efficiency. They let us settle, divide our labor, build increasingly complex societies. We would not be sitting here today without farming. We can't sustain 8 billion, 7 billion people on this planet without farming. For the vast majority of human history, a person's thoughts died with them. But the written word gave our thoughts immortality. We teach our children to write basically as soon as they can physically handle a pen. We can preserve the ideas of the past. We can learn from them in the present. Each new generation is now able to stand on the shoulders of the generations that came before. They don't have to start over, maybe with some storytelling and some verbal knowledge. And I see this very clearly. Like the internet and the devices that we use to connect to it are becoming that kind of extension of ourselves, of our neurology. Recently, my girlfriend and I were taking a road trip from New York to Virginia. We had 4 and 6-year-old boys in the back seat of the car, so that was a fun trip. The older of the two has an old hand-me-down smartphone. Take a moment and think about how ridiculous that is. It's an old hand-me-down smartphone. But he has this old iPhone. It doesn't have a data plan, obviously, because he's 6, but it only works on Wi-Fi. And as we're driving through the countryside, he is occasionally asking Siri for pictures of whatever animal it was that he was like obsessed with at the time, praying mantises or crocodiles or whatever it happened to be. And he just doesn't understand why Siri can't answer him in the car. Because for him, the internet is not a thing that is bound up inside of computers and cables and phone lines. I grew up with the internet in the sense that I've had access to the internet since I was a teenager. I feel very, very comfortable on the internet. I almost feel like an internet citizen before I am a citizen of the rest of the world sometimes. But for me, the internet is still bound up inside of devices. For him, it pervades his world. He has never known a world where he can't just ask questions and have them answered, where he just doesn't have immediate access to this like sum of human knowledge. He doesn't live in a world where that knowledge is, at the very best, like paraphrased in a set of overpriced encyclopedias, where at the very worst, it's almost inaccessible, locked up in a library somewhere. And I'm not bemoaning this. I know a lot of people say, these damn kids, they can't get their faces out of their phones. I think it's terrific. I can't imagine how different my life would have been if I'd had access to this kind of technology when I was 6 years old. I was one of those kids who read constantly. My mother, we didn't have a lot of money growing up. My mother scraped and scraped to buy me a full set of Funkin' Wagnalls encyclopedias, one of them every month for 2 years. And I read those encyclopedias, each volume, over and over and over again, until the bindings came apart. Our children and grandchildren are growing up in a world where knowledge just flows almost as freely as tap water. And it really makes my heart swell when I think about what they're going to be able to do with that. The smartphone is not just a device. For them, it is an embedded tool of cognition. It's an upgraded and vastly more powerful form of the mnemonics and times tables that we used to understand our world when we were their age. The internet is growing at an obscene pace. Mapping it defies geography. I think this is one of the best maps of the internet that I've seen. It's fractal and it's alive. The number of things connected to the internet is almost uncountable. We outgrew IPv4, billions of available addresses, like completely inadequate. So now we're looking at IPv6. IPv6 has an address space of 3.4 times 10 to the 38th power. 10 to the 38th power is literally an astronomical order of magnitude. And by that I mean there are more potential available IPv6 addresses than there are stars in the available universe. I love thinking about that. We are working with technology that is so much more complex than we're really even capable of comprehending. There's no one in this room, there may be no human being alive on this planet who understands how every component inside of a cell phone works in detail. We're building systems that are more complex than we can grok in our own minds. Serious thinkers are looking forward, looking ahead to this technological singularity, a point where we develop computing systems that are capable of refining and improving themselves, and refining and improving themselves at an exponential rate, to where they're in cycles of improvement are completely divorced from anything that we humans are doing. And they're looking at that future not hundreds of years ahead, but potentially in our own children's lifetimes. We in this room are building that future, a little piece of it, a little corner of it. We're the ones who are going to shape what that future looks like. We're the ones who are close enough to the beast to see the warts. We know how much terrible code there is in the world, and we know that everything in the world runs on code, and that's a statement that's getting more and more true each day. Thermostats are now running on software. Refrigerators are running on software. Food safety equipment is running on software, and we know how crap code can be. We've seen the broken authentication systems. We've seen the misguided attempts at cryptography. We've seen the dirty hacks and the temporary fixes that are just going to get us over this hump, but end up holding systems together for years and years. We know how badly it can go wrong. How many of you, like me, smiled really smugly when the PlayStation Network breach was announced? I mean, they failed to patch known exploitable vulnerabilities. I don't know if Chris Cornett is in the room, and he can correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's OWASP number 9 on the OWASP top 10, not patching known exploitable vulnerabilities. They were down for 25 days. They ended up losing $170 million. That's not even counting the PR nightmare that resulted. What about the Mars Climate Orbiter in 1999? In this case, the engineers didn't build to spec. The people who were writing the software for the ground computer ignored or didn't notice that in the spec they were supposed to give output in the metric unit Newton seconds, and instead gave it in the imperial unit pound seconds. And this $300 million orbiter that had been painstakingly designed and crafted by some of our society's greatest minds, instead of gently entering orbit around Mars and collecting important information about its climate, went crashing into the atmosphere and was incinerated. We know how much it cost to build the thing. We have no idea how much it cost to lose that scientific data that was never collected. Those are two examples where nobody died. In the 1980s, really kind of happened throughout the 1980s, because it took a long time to find this. The Therac 25 radiation therapy machine had a design defect. Earlier models had used a hardware safety interlock, but the Therac 25 introduced a software safety lock, which is not something I really want on a radiation machine, but software safety interlock. And there was a design flaw. There was a buffer overflow that happened, and if that buffer overflow happened to happen while the operator was activating the machine, it just gave you all the radiation. At least 3 people that we know of died from radiation overdose. At least 3 more were injured. In 1991, during the Gulf War, there was a rounding error in the missile guidance system for the Patriot defensive missile battery systems. And in this case, they were doing a date calculation based on epoch time, where they were recording time in tenths of a second and then had to divide. And they had a rounding error that caused them to lose track of the time, which allows them to lose track of an incoming missile. And that missile hit a Marine barracks, killed 28 soldiers, injured almost 100 more. Software matters. It's not just errors that are dangerous. Our capacity to collect and manage information has absolutely kept pace with the general growth of the internet. I've been working on data projects for almost 20 years. It used to be that data sets that were a few terabytes in size were almost unmanageably large. They required data centers filled with complex and expensive equipment. Today, with open source tools and relatively inexpensive cloud computing resources, we can easily manage data sets that dwarf the things that I worked with early on in my career. We have some data sets at AOL that I think are approaching 50 petabytes of data. That's a ridiculous number, a ridiculous quantity of data. The capacity that we have to do good with this is immense. This is a screenshot of healthmap.org, and they have a very interesting mission. They collect information from public health officials, but they do it passively by analyzing unstructured data like news reports. And they take that unstructured data, and from it they extract and construct epidemiological information. This is a map of the current 2016 Zika virus outbreak. It is updated more or less live by passively monitoring the activity of these public health officials around the world and the journalists who are reporting on them. This thing is a triaxial accelerometer. Triaxial accelerometers back in the past used to be the size of a large house cat. This thing is shown extremely large. It's about that big. I have one in here. I wear this thing about almost 24 hours a day. It generates a constant stream of information about how it's moving through 3-dimensional space. And that data is essentially meaningless, if you think about it. But if you can collect enough of it from my wrist, and from the wrists of all the people in this room who are wearing this kind of data, you can start to analyze it and look for patterns. You can look for patterns that indicate this person is walking, this person is going upstairs, this person is running or riding a bike. And you can develop algorithms that turn vast quantities of raw data into a detailed record of someone's motion throughout the day. And you combine that with a cheap optical heart rate monitor, and you create a dashboard where you can see a full day's activity. And I can share this with my doctor. Your resting heart rate is a very good indication of your general health, something that your doctor wants to know. It's very hard to get that without wearing a heart monitor. Now you can wear a heart monitor. And this really blows my mind when I think about it. This is fucking science fiction shit. This is Dr. McCoy's bio bed. It's strapped to my wrist. I paid $149 for it on Amazon, and that included free next day shipping. But it opens so many questions. Do I own that data? Does Fitbit own it? If they own it, do I have any say over what they do with it? How much control do I have? Can I be sure that they're being responsible with my data, that they're anonymizing it, keeping it secure, keeping it private? And how can we even approach this problem to understand and weigh the risks and the benefits? Because the benefits are tremendous and the risks are tremendous, and it's confusing. What about the folks who are trying to at least do things somewhat responsibly, but then they're set upon by governments that are scared of strong encryption, and understandably strong encryption? I mean, this is a very complicated issue. We've operated, at least in the United States, under this presumption that you're secure in your private affairs, in your papers, unless you've been subpoenaed by a court. But what about when those papers are unsubpoenaable? Is that a word? Unsubpoenaable? And even that, like, this is as good as long as strong encryption stays strong. And how long is that going to be? I mean, every computer in the world is essentially a set of complex abstractions over this. These are logic gates. They are at the core of every computation that every computing device on the planet runs. When we talk about Moore's law, what we're talking about is the density of these logic gates inside of a computer, how small we can make them. And when we talk about running up against Moore's law is the approximate doubling of computing density every 2 years. It's because our ability to miniaturize these logic gates is actually running up against like physical barriers. Quantum mechanics are weird, and when you start running into problems, when you get small enough, you start running into problems of quantum probability. And if you're looking at a single electron flowing through a transistor, it's not a close to 100% probability that that electron is going to end up where you expect it to be. It's actually quite a large probability it's going to end up someplace you don't expect it to be. So you need to build in more and more error checking. And we're very quickly approaching that limit where we're talking about transistors that are etched into silicon on the scale of nanometers, that are talking about like single or very few number of electrons flowing through them. But this doesn't mean that the end of Moore's law is coming. What's coming is this. It's still in the lab. These are quantum logic gates. It's still in the lab. But probably practical quantum computers are not more than a few decades away. They will be expensive. They will be incredibly complex. They may be only in the reach of governments and very large corporations, similar to how computers were 50 years ago, out of the reach of common people, but certainly well within the grasp of companies and the government. And quantum computing completely changes the game when it comes to cryptography. Any cryptographic algorithm that relies on the fact that it's very hard for computers to factorize integers or to calculate discrete logarithms, done. It's a quantum algorithm. Shor's algorithm just defeats them. So RSA, DSA, Diffie-Hellman, just done. Don't work. Not useful. Symmetric encryption models, strong hash functions, are not completely defeated, but they are significantly weakened. So what do we do? That's my boss. What does this new revolution look like? Honestly, I don't know. The technology is going to continue to grow. It's going to grow in power, and it's going to grow in complexity. Our ideas about privacy are already changing. And if you talk to your kids or your grandkids about their ideas of privacy, you're going to see how much they're changing. They almost don't have a concept of it. The corporate components of the digital world can be our partners, or they can be our enemies. And the future can be one of tighter control and constrained access, or one of greater sharing and collaboration. I do know that we seem to have that we have seen the power that open source has to transform. It's transforming companies. It's transforming a lot of things about our industry. I remember what our industry looked like 20 years ago. Everything was built in-house. Every line of code was a closely guarded secret. Over time, though, we, and by we I mean us in the open source world, the open source community, have started to make a difference. We've pushed open source software into that corporate world by making the case that broader networks of contributors lead to better, stronger platforms that are safer, that have more accountability behind them. And we've mostly held true to the ideal that what you use, you also support. And we've fought. I know I've fought. I'm sure a lot of you have fought with your employers, if you work for a corporation, for the right to commit back to those projects. We've taught the corporate world that open source is far more than just code. Supporting open source means supporting standards bodies. It means supporting conferences. It means supporting meetups and bloggers. It means supporting experimentation and innovation. And honestly, I think it's a good sign that I'm seeing banks reaching out and trying to be part of the open source world. I started my career in the financial services industry, and that is the most closed-off industry. But they're starting to understand that they need to reach out and become part of our community and understand our ways if they want access to our ability and our talent. The thing is, what we do, it's not magic. It can seem like that to the uninitiated. Anyone can learn to write code. But to be a good software engineer requires a commitment to lifelong learning. You have to face tough problems and not back down. You have to grind against them until you figure them out. A software engineer can't ever look at failure as anything but an opportunity to learn. And you can't ever look at success as anything but a temporary way station on the way to future success. What we do is hard. We build software, and software runs the world. It will continue to run the world. It will continue to run more and more of the world. So what do we do right now? I'm going to assume that most of you are engineers, or that you manage engineers, or work with engineers, or in some way support engineers. You're an elite group among engineers because you're here. Most of the people who work in our industry will never show up at a conference like this. And you guys care enough to show up. You aren't content with what you know. You're driven by your curiosity, your desire to get better, to build better. And you take what you learn here about building better software. Take what you learn here about protecting your users' data, about security, about operations and testing and quality. Practice it until it becomes second nature. Find the hardest parts of it, the parts that really make your brain strain, and beat your head against it until you get it. Embrace the see it, do it, teach it ethic of our open source heritage and the academic and hacker cultures that preceded it, and share what you learn with your colleagues, your coworkers. While you're here at this conference, surrounded by a few hundred of your fellow software engineers, find a mentor who can help you. Find people that you can help by mentoring. Share what you learn by blogging. Speak at your local user group. Submit to conferences. Speak at conferences. When you see bugs in code, send pull requests. Demand better code reviews from the people who review your code. And commit to giving better code reviews when you review other people's code. Help your non-technical friends and relatives understand why their privacy and security is important. Help them understand how the world is changing and why they need to be aware of it. Share what you learn with your family and your friends. Share it with your representatives in government. We're standing at a pivotal moment in history. So much has changed in the last 47 years since Bill Duvall and Charlie Klein connected these first two hosts together on the internet. But that is nothing compared to how much it's going to change over the next 47 years. We're privileged to be the ones that are building that future. It's in our power to decide how our children and grandchildren are going to understand things like security and privacy, how they're going to communicate, how they're going to learn. The digital revolution has changed all of our lives, and this coming revolution, and I honestly don't know what it looks like. It may change our very understanding of existence or humanity or thought. It's very easy to lionize the achievements of people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and we should. They did great things for our industry and built cool stuff, but they are heroes of a world that is changing so quickly that we may not recognize it before too long. Our culture in this room is a culture of service. The heroes of our revolution are the people who serve their friends and colleagues tirelessly. Some of my heroes are in this room. I'm not going to point their names out. They know who they are. Hopefully you know who they are too. They are the people who work for hours and hours to prepare their talks at this conference. They are the people who organize meetups, people who struggle through a problem, and when they find a solution, write about it on their blog. So the next person who's searching for a solution to that problem can start from a more advanced position. They're the people who set up mailing lists, the people who answer questions on IRC and Stack Overflow and Slack. The heroes of our revolution are not going to be found in corporate boardrooms. They're going to be found in conference ballrooms like this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. All right, the next sessions begin at 10:30. Two quick things we forgot to mention this morning. At Community Night, we're also having a security capture the flag event being run by Chris Cornett, our web security trainer. Also, please go check out the Open Spaces board. There's a lot of great talks happening there. We have updated the conference app with the various Open Spaces slots that are happening, so you can also see them on there as well. So thank you and have a great day.